Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. We carry out our work on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're delighted to share this conversation with author and professor of anthropology, Wade Davis. The author of 24 books, Davis joined us to discuss his latest collection of essays, Beneath the Surface of Things. Written during the days of the COVID-19 travel restrictions, the book captures reflections on subjects from across the planet, from the demonization of coca to the unraveling of America. He speaks with Laura Lynch, the host of CBC's What on Earth, a show about climate change. This event was recorded live on May 1st, 2024. Vancouver Writers Fest would like to thank our public sector funders, without whom we couldn't do our work. They are the Government of Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island.
Get settled there. Okay, let me put this down here. Thank you for doing this, Wade. I was telling Wade that we met many years ago. So it's okay that he may not remember that, but it's really lovely to see you again.
Well, thank you, Laura.
And obviously I have had a chance to read the book that's only just been released. And it ranges over such territory. You decided to write about a few really easy, non-controversial, lighthearted issues like Israel, Palestine, climate change, war, race, slavery, the unraveling of America. But, to be fair, you also talk about exploring and a beautiful message to your daughter and what you call the essence of the sacred. And I'm just kind of wondering how you came to write the essays, how you chose the subjects that you wanted to explore.
Well, I think we all, experienced that kind of moment when the world stood still. I remember when I was a kid, my hero was Gary Snyder, the poet, and I made a pilgrimage to his place in the Sierra Nevada, Kikidisi in California, and I asked him, what could we best do to save the wild? And I'll never forget that he responded, stay put. And in fact, what we saw during COVID was the unbelievable resilience of the earth. Suddenly in Barcelona, there were wild boars, and the Yosemite Valley had wolves and grizzly bear. The wetlands of Mumbai were flush with flamingos. In the districts of Kathmandu and Karachi, they could look up and see the sky and the white summits of the Himalaya scraping the summit of the world. And rivers in Medellin and Bogota ran like trout streams. We suddenly saw this amazing potential. It was like a new dream of the earth. And of course, the earth was not renewed. And we returned to our old habits very quickly with a kind of a haste and confidence that was itself disturbing. But I found that moment, like all of us, we all had these crazy, these plans. And when we look back at that COVID moment, we don't really remember the planetary, but the personal, where we were and what we were doing when the world skidded to a halt and all of our precious plans went to the car wash. And for me, it was kind of an incredible reprieve. I felt like a schoolboy who had stumbled upon a summer vacation he hadn't expected, And all my previous life began to look like a violent hallucination. And in place of ethnographic expeditions, books became my focus. And I found in books such luminosity, and I just began to write. And one of the things that, of course, happened then, I had a book coming out, Magdalena, in 2020, And there was no way to promote a book unless you wrote articles for some outlet that had a little byline, Wade Davis, author of Magdalena. So I started writing these things for Financial Times. And I never thought of pulling these books, these essays together into a book. But Nancy Flight, the wonderful editor at Greystone, picked up a pattern that I really hadn't seen myself, which is that all these essays kind of were concocted through the anthropological lens, and that notion of the anthropological lens, I had a wonderful mentor, Johannes Wilbert at UCLA, who had lived 40 years with the Winikina Warao in the Orinoco Delta, and I would fly from Boston to LA just to spend a weekend with him in his cabin in the mountains above the city, and his mind would sweep over the whole field of anthropology, and he had a way of expressing profundity in a phrase. And one day he said to me, anthropology allows us to see beneath the surface of things. And I love that idea. It doesn't call for the elimination of judgment. It calls for the suspension of judgment, so the very judgments we're ethically and morally obliged to make can be informed ones. And when it's brought into focus, it has a marvelous ability to illuminate hope and the promise of human potential, because after all, it's totally non-judgmental. It's celebrating the wonder of who we are as a single species, all interconnected genetically, all of us just trying to figure out what it means to be human and alive. And that's the glory of culture, is that every culture is an answer to that fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And when they answer that question, the cultures of the world do so in 7,000 languages. And the great revelation of anthropology, informed by genetics, is that we really are cut from the same genetic cloth. So we share the same genius. So critically, how we express that genius is simply a matter of choice. So there is no hierarchy of culture. That old Victorian idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian and the civilized to the Strand of London is a meaningless artifact of the 19th century, no more relevant to our lives today than the notion that clergymen had then that the earth was just 6,000 years old. So what this means is that the way human societies use our common genius is simply a matter of adaptive choice, right? So a classic example of that would be the kind of vision of the Aboriginal people of Australia. When the British first arrived in those distant shores, they saw people who looked strange, who had a simple material technology. But what offended the British is that the Aboriginal people had no interest in progress, in change through time. They didn't idealize the notion of change through time. And in their inimitable way, the British concluded that they weren't humans at all, and they began to shoot them. And as recently as 1902, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Melbourne as to whether or not Aboriginal people were human or not, right? But what was really happening was a subtle devotional philosophy, the dreaming, which wasn't a dream. It was a commitment to the notion that the world both exists and is constantly being formed, and the purpose of humanity isn't to change the world, it's to preserve the world exactly as it was at the time of its creation. Well, you can question whether that was good or bad, but 50,000 years hence, we look back and we'll ask ourselves, in the time of climate change, was that not true human wisdom, right? So these essays all kind of came about as I tried to grapple with all, because the thing is, you can sit still, but the world never sits still. And as we're in this whirlwind of solitude, the world kept spinning, And a kind of classic example of that is the essay, The Unraveling of America.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. What a very good entree.
We didn't rehearse this, I promise you.
I mean, that essay, it's provocative, and it was written, as you said, during the pandemic, and it reflects that time around the unbelievably bad way the United States handled or mishandled the pandemic. Trump was in charge. I'm wondering how you view, maybe you could talk a little bit about what you wrote then and how you view that in the context of how things turned out and how things are today.
Well, that's a really good point. Of all the essays in this book, the one that feels to me to be dated is that one. The genesis of that was I had been asked by a lot of editors to write about COVID. And this was the low point in the summer of 2020. You remember how it was then? And I really didn't think I had anything new to say. And then I was paddling a kayak with my friend Ross Beatty around Bowen Island. And Ross's wife, Trish, is a physician. And I had this flash that COVID wasn't about public health or medicine. It was about history and culture. And I came back to shore, and Trish was there, and I said, Trish, it's not about medicine. And she, as a doctor, said, I know. And then I went home that night, and I started writing on spec, and I wrote 7,000 words in 2 days. And I sent it off to Jan Wenner, Rolling Stone, an old friend of mine. He gave it to his son, Gus, and it got into the hands of a brilliant young female editor. We honed it down, and they just put it up on the website on August 6, 2020. It went ballistic. It had 362 million social media impressions. 5 million people read it on the Rolling Stone site. It was the most read essay in the English language that year.
And how much did you get paid for that?
I didn't make any money at all. I didn't get paid a penny because I just gave it on spec, you know. But I wasn't doing it to make money. I wanted to make that statement. But the thing about it is the essay got some things right and some things wrong. At the time, Canada seemed to be escaping COVID. Mm-hmm. It certainly did not. At the time, who could have guessed that a new array of RNA-based vaccines would come onto the stage in months when previously the fastest development of a vaccine for mumps had been 4 years. And the development of those new vaccines served to almost affirm the very exceptionalism of America that the essay was calling into question. At the same time, I think the essay achieved such attention and it sparked media interest in 23 countries. I had media interview. I did an interview with Harry Srinivasan of PBS and Steve Bannon of his War Room back to back on the night before Steve was arrested. I mean, it just attacked, you know, because everybody was asking, what the heck is this? And I like to think, you know, the strength of the essay is that it was not an indictment, it wasn't polemical, it wasn't ideological, it was really an intervention. And, you know, if you do an intervention, you're holding a mirror to someone you love to show them how far they've fallen. And that's what struck me about America in that terrible summer, is that the Americans continued, as they do to this day, to look into the mirror and see what they once were, unaware of how crumbled that mirror has been, and the shards of the glass actually lie around their feet. But it was written with real empathy for a country that I adore. Mm-hmm. I mean, I became an American citizen having been born in Canada. I mean, I'm also an Irish citizen, a Colombian citizen. But the point is that, you know, America made my life possible. I married an American. My career would never have happened in Canada. So I have great affection for America. But the great thing about America is you're free to criticize it. And as Cory Booker said, if America hasn't broken your heart, you don't love her enough.
Right, Cory Booker, the senator. Yeah. So, do you say then maybe it's time for another intervention? If you say they're looking in the mirror.
Well, I think the fundamental thrust of that essay, which challenged the American denial of community. You know, in the wake of World War II, the nation never stood down. Personal freedom became defined by the right of an individual to own a personal arsenal of weaponry. Families were scattered all across the country. The cult of the individual surpassed the power and resonance of community. And one thing I said in that essay that some Canadians who are critical of our own country challenged, but I think is fundamentally true, is, you know, Robin Williams' great thing about Canada. He said to live in Canada is like living in an apartment above a meth lab. And at the time, you know, I think this is fair enough to say, you know, the great travel writer, Jan Morris, who had been John Morris, who reported Hillary's success on Everest and then became one of the first sort of famous trans individual. She wrote a great book, Conundrum, about that passage. But she famously said that in Vancouver you could drown in niceness. And she had bumped into someone on Granville Street. And of course, what did the Canadians say? I'm sorry. And she wanted to know, as she wrote, why was this Canadian apologizing to me? But she didn't understand that the phrase, I'm sorry, in Canada is not an apology, it's a mantra. It's a way of saying, you and I live in this godforsaken land where you could turn the United States on the side, plunk it into Canada, have 1,500 more kilometers going to the North Pole. For most of our history, we had more lakes than people. This damn winter hovers in our imagination. We're a people of consilience. We get along with each other. So I'm sorry. You're not apologizing to the person. You're apologizing for the incident. And that's what the phrase I'm sorry means in Canada.
That is a great anthropological insight.
When I was thinking about trying to explain in that essay my sense of the difference between Canada and the United States, I thought of getting your groceries at Safeway. And when you get your groceries at Safeway, almost anywhere in the United States, I think it's fair to say there's a kind of a cultural, racial, educational, class chasm between you and the checkout person, which is difficult to bridge. So you just do your thing. But in Canada, that doesn't exist. If you go to a Safeway in the West End of Vancouver, you know, the person at the checkout may not have your education, they may have different circumstances, they may not have your affluence, but they know that you know that they know they're getting a decent wage because of the unions. And they know that in the West End, because Safeways are always neighborhood-based, probably your kids go to the same public school, right? And more importantly of all, they know that you know that they know that you know that if their kids get sick, they get exactly the same medical treatment as the Prime Minister's kids. And those three strands woven together become the fabric of Canadian social democracy. And one of the things the States is always saying, you know, that social democracy is communism light. That'll never work in America. And that's probably true, but if so, it's a stunning indictment and a reinforcement of what Oscar Wilde said about America as being the only country to go from birth to decadence without passing through civilization. And the truth is that we're not a perfect place, but what the Americans don't and never have understood about healthcare is that it's got nothing to do with medicine. It's got everything to do with social solidarity. And one of the reasons that America is such a tense, angry place is people feel that they're not paid attention to. They feel left out. That's the whole Trump phenomena, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why only 12% of Canadians, as polled, would even imagine voting for Donald Trump, whereas it looks very likely that this bone spur warrior, this grifter, this shadow of a man who isn't even continent, if you've ever seen him in his golf outfit. You know, he wears those big suits and the tie to hide his belly. He puts elevated things in it to lean forward, but see him on the golf course, and that's the man they're going to elect again. So it's awfully nice to be Canadian.
I don't want to take you down this path too far because there's so much else to talk about, but I do have to say that some of that has crept into Canadian opinion, Canadian activity. There are people who can't get doctors. There are people who aren't able to access the care they need. There are complaints in this country that echo the complaints in the United States. There is a political leader that some say models himself after Trump. So that some of that seems to be creeping in here too.
Well, I think, you know, we all social democracies are dealing with this strange confluence, which is so historic. You know, on the one hand, the horror of social media and the democratization of opinion, where everybody thinks their opinions matter. And then you have, I've noticed this at UBC, where I'm a professor, where I teach a graduate seminar that attracts advanced graduate students from all faculties. And these are good students. And UBC is a great university. It ranks 39th in the world. But I recall my horror when I asked the class, well, let me just say, not one of them knew the name Mao Zedong. And I had an undergraduate from Seattle who was very keen, and keen on poetry and music, had never heard of Bob Dylan. Now, you may not like Bob Dylan's voice now, but not to have heard of Bob Dylan when you profess a love of music and poetry. The point is that we're also dealing with a generation that grew up in the iPhone, and it's been told since youth they don't have to know, they can acquire knowledge, right? And then add to that ChatGPT and AI, and you've got a pretty toxic whirlwind, and that's what we're living through, right? So some of that spasm of darkness is going to spin into Canada as it does in Denmark or any other country.
Well, that sounds
and we
like
have to be vigilant.
That sounds like another essay in the making. Let's come back to the book, because you also wrote about Israel and Palestine. And I have to ask you, because as we know, so much has happened in the last several months. You go through the history of the conflict there, but it was...
Well, that was an essay I wrote long before the events of this fall.
Yes.
As to the events of this fall, there's a wonderful Quaker expression, don't say anything if you can't improve upon silence. And I don't think that any of us have a right, in a sense, and there certainly shouldn't be an expectation that everybody has to offer an opinion about that horrendous situation. You know, what I wrote in the essay was just trying to explain the genesis of it. I was going to Jerusalem, and I knew I was going to have to explain to people with me how the heck this... And the whole thing about the Middle East that's so tragic is that it's not a story of religion, of course. It's not even a story of land. It's all about who controls the historical narrative. And the tragedy is, and what the essay in the book clearly lays out in a very non-polemical way, is the absolute truth that the Palestinians were displaced from their land. You can't deny that. And it's gotten to the point where the supreme irony is the Palestinians have become the new Zionists. And they have a history of violation, they have a history of displacement, and they have a mythological sense of their attachment to the land that will allow them to wait 1900 years for justice to be done, just as the Jewish people waited 1900 years from their perspective for justice to be done. And that's why that conflict is so entrenched. And it's interesting that essay began actually as a lecture in my undergraduate course at UBC. And one year I gave that lecture, and this wonderful Israeli young woman who adored the course, was front seat every time, broke down into tears, thinking that the essay was completely against Israel. The next year, I had a young Palestinian youth in that class who was equally dispirited at the end of that lecture, certain that the lecture was completely biased against the Palestinians. And that was kind of a symbol of the challenge of that place.
That is exactly what you said. It's about whose narrative wins out, and because they build up over time and they achieve mythological status. But if you say that both sides are willing to wait for 1900 years for justice, that portends a conflict that will never end.
I don't think it will ever end, actually. I mean, of all conflicts on earth, I think that one's going to be perpetual. And those of you who have traveled in Jordan or Israel or in that area, as a Canadian, one of the strangest sensations you have is how damn small a place is. I mean, you can start in Petra, for example, in Jordan, and literally walk towards the West Bank and walking towards the Mediterranean. I mean, that whole area, throw in Syria, throw in Jordan, half of Egypt, you could toss it anywhere in Canada, they'd never find it. You know, I mean, and so it's this concentration of hatred and vengeance and righteousness, you know, and it can't be distilled into a simple matter of numerical deaths, you know, it's just so much more. And so I think sometimes decency calls for silence.
Yeah. I will say, having been there myself a few times, working in midst of conflict and otherwise, what tends to be overlooked, and you would know this, is the rich cultures that they have both developed, and the risk of it never being seen for what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the Temple Mount, I mean, there's no place on earth, 120 acres, that has resonated with more spiritual desire, but in a kind of a whirlwind, a cauldron of hatred where violence is waiting to be born. I mean, you've got right there, you have Christianity, of course, Islam and Judaism, and a funny thing that I touch upon in the essay on the sacred is, a lot of people ask me how I remain so optimistic, eternally optimistic. And I think a big part of that is that my father was a tremendous influence. And my mom had a classic kind of Christian idea that if we just worked hard enough, good would triumph over evil. Well, my dad, broken by the war, had no such illusions. He used to say, there's good and evil in the world, son. Take your pick and get on with it. And it was so wise, because good and evil walk side by side, will never eliminate darkness. And if you think you can defeat darkness, you're going to be disillusioned, and out of that comes bitterness. So even on issues like climate or any of the challenges, the minute you indulge ideological passions, certainties, you end up becoming angry and embittered and often disillusioned. Or you end up what the climate movement has done to children, is terrify young people. And what is life but a story we lose the power of comprehending as we get old? And what is the cruelest thing that an elder can do than to say to a young person, the world used to be great, now it's a mess, it's up to you to fix it? What nonsense. It's like people who say, oh, the 60s were so great, you should have been at Woodstock. Watch that damn movie, you'll just want to have a bath, and so one of the things I learned from my father was that you'll never triumph over evil, you'll win some battles, lose some battles. It's more like the Buddhist notion of the pilgrim. The pilgrim's path in life is not a destination, it's a state of mind. And if you recognize that you'll never triumph over evil, there's no reason to stop fighting for the good, and that's all we can do. That's all we can do. And you do that without anger and without ego, and so then you just keep going. So I'm 70 now, and I don't feel really different than when I was 20. I'm still idealistic. I've still got lots of energy. I've got lots of dreams, lots of books to write. I mean, I've been in 17 countries since September. I mean, nothing's changed. So I think that idea is like, don't get attached to your mission.
You raised climate. Obviously, it's a preoccupation for me, given the work that I do these days. It's your longest essay in the book, I think, about climate.
It's also, I took so many months to write that essay because it's such dangerous ground. Any challenge to the climate consensus invites controversy.
Some of it took me aback, for sure. So tell me what you were trying to say with it.
What I was trying to say is in no way denying the reality of anthropogenic climate change, but simply suggesting the obvious, that the way we've approached it is not working. And this kind of obsession with getting to net zero, which was really established in Al Gore's 1992 book, where he dismissed mitigation and adaptation as forms of climate denial. And we've had this kind of obsession to get to net zero, but the pathway there is not going to be realized, not even close. And the idea that we can only get to net zero and then deal with the other problems of the world ignores the fact that only by dealing with the other problems of the world do we have a chance to get to net zero.
And survive.
Yeah. So, for example, the call for making sure we don't get beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, that was sort of put out by policymakers to scientists, and the scientists came back having been asked the impossible. They delivered the impossible, a set of prescriptions that would never be realized because of the realities of the world. And again, the message here is not climate denial, it's that realism is not apathy and rhetoric no substitute for results. And so when that 1.5 thing was floated, the media picked it up not as a theoretical possibility, but as an existential imperative, allowing CNN to say the world's got 10 years left. And that, in a sense, was a disservice. And the real figure of 1.5 we should be paying attention to is this one, and this is the ultimate salvation. If a human population's reproductive rate drops to 1.5 or below for 2 generations, the national population drops in half. Korea is 0.8. Ukraine is 1.01. Virtually every country in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, Asia, including China, even India is 2.08. In other words, your great-grandchildren will live through a period of demographic collapse unprecedented in the history of humanity. And that's not being driven by ideology. It's not being driven by polemics. It's not being driven by regulations. It's just happening. And the reason this is happening is because of women. And the single most important thing we can do to mitigate and resolve the climate crisis is liberate women. Give them freedom of their bodies and economic opportunities. So paradoxically, one of the key things to do is economic development. Because as people come out of poverty, birth rates collapse. And when the birth rate collapses by half, as it will do inevitably in the lifetime of my great-great-grandchildren, some of this problem will take care of itself. Now, a perfect example of that is the money set aside at Paris to mitigate climate through the year 2100, $1 to $2 trillion a year, money that we all know will not be allocated and certainly never spent, but nevertheless, there it is on paper. If you took 1 month of that allocation that is to be spent through the year 2100, 1 month of that allocation would lift the entire global population out of extreme poverty. So the point is that the way to get to climate is to do exactly what we need for the world itself. Of course, there are things we can do. Right now, subsidies to the oil and gas industry are $7.4 trillion. That means we're subsidizing twice as much virtually as all governments spend on education, 2/3 as much as we spend on healthcare. Food waste. The Americans throw away $400 billion worth of food every year, 108 billion meals. That 8% of our carbon emission comes from landfills of food waste in a hungry world. So there's lots of very practical things we can do, but when we decide not to fly in airplanes, nice if you don't want to fly in airplanes, but don't think it's going to change things because 80% of the world has never flown. The biggest airline market in the world is India. It has 39 airlines, and just 2 of them, Air India and Indigo Air, at Paris last fair, bought 1,000 Airbuses and Boeings. By 2040, the world's airline industry will buy 42,000 Airbuses and Boeing. What we need to do is find hydrogen fuel, not tell people not to fly. One of the problems is the gross hypocrisy of the whole thing. John Kerry runs around the world telling every country to stop its carbon emissions, whereas last year, the United States, already the 3rd biggest consumer of coal, the biggest exporter of oil, became the biggest exporter of natural gas. In the first year of the Biden administration, he authorized more oil and gas developments by a factor of 899 than Trump did in his first year in office, an unabashed climate denier. So it doesn't mean that all of these gestures are not significant. Social change happens when people take a stand. It doesn't mean that melting ice and rising seawaters aren't a concern, but the way we're addressing it is clearly not being efficacious. In 2022, even as wildfires swept France and heat waves tormented England, a CNN New York Times poll had only 1% of Americans defining climate change as their biggest challenge. And amongst the generation most affected, under 30, it only went up to 3%. So something is not working. And if we're going to actually...
What's not working? Are they being scared and they just don't want to deal with it?
No, it's because we're not addressing the key things we need to do. I mean, Vancouver, for example, has with great fanfare called to get to net zero by 2030. Meanwhile, the province of British Columbia colludes with industry to cut 65 million cubic meters of timber every year, laying waste to 500,000 hectares. The boreal forests of Canada are being leveled to create 2-ply toilet paper. They're the greatest carbon sink in the world, 4 times more effective than a tropical forest. You know, environmentalists should not go to the next carbon meeting. There's been, you know, how many COP whatevers have there been? We should stay home and protect the resources of home, because that's how we can sequester carbon from the environment. Right now, only 2% of the global budget of climate mediation goes to proven natural solutions using the miracle of photosynthesis to reduce and draw carbon out of the air. You know, I think the cruelest thing of all is the consequences for young people. You know, change never comes from fear. It only comes from hope and the promise of a better world. The statistics on how fearful our young people are. I mean, half of North American kids not be prepared to have children because they fear the world's coming to an end. I mean, you know, Greta's a very interesting phenomenon, you know, if you think about her. If you look at her own biography, and I'm not being critical of her dreams, but her biography is that at the age of 8, she heard about climate change and she got terrified, and she couldn't understand why adults weren't doing anything about it. She stopped eating and lost 22 pounds. She stopped speaking. She was afflicted by depression. She eventually was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, compulsive disorder, and selective mutism. She was still suffering from depression when she heard John Kerry say the world was coming to an end in 9 years. She began her brave protest. She electrified the world. She inspired youth. And for those who believed the world was coming to an end in this apocalyptic thing, how could she be wrong? But at the same time, when I look into her face to this day, even as her rhetoric becomes more and more strident, even as she calls for the immediate cessation of all carbon emissions, which a policy which, if invoked, would paralyze the global economy and lead to the death of millions, I just see the porcelain face of a child fearful that the world is coming to an end. And I don't think, as a father, we have a right to do that to our children.
I won't go on. Obviously, this is an area that I live in this area. I swim in climate solutions. It's every day. I will say that, I said this to you before we started, that I do see the conversation shifting. I do see more of a focus on the things that you're talking about, adaptation, mitigation, ways to prepare for this instead of alongside the focus of trying to cut emissions.
I mean, it's like, Laura, it's like sea level rise. I mean, the truth is we're in an interglacial period. No scientist denies that the sea level is rising. And at this point, it's been rising about a foot a century for a long time, and that's going to continue. The key question to try to figure out, especially before we spend trillions of dollars, is how much of the current sea level rise, for example, which we'll have to deal with, even if there was no anthropogenic climate challenge, how much of it is caused by anthropogenic climate impacts and how much from the geological processes we know underway. It's not so simple. You know, hurricanes, for example, we know that climate change and global warming is causing extreme weather. But we also have to understand that the damage is also based on other human behaviors. So, for example, there are more hurricanes came through Florida in the early years of the 20th century than the last 50 years. But if a hurricane came through Dade County and Broward County today, it would be affecting more human beings than lived between Virginia and Texas when I was born, right? So this has a whole different a kind of impact. And you can, and it's all about being realistic about what's going on. I mean, electric cars. Everybody, especially Elon Musk, loves the idea that we think electric cars are the solution. But remember that an electric car has 20% of it is plastic, fossil fuels. Remember that the carbon footprint of a vehicle, majority of that carbon footprint happens in the manufacturing, and making an electric car consumes a lot more carbon. Its toxicity index is hugely more because of the heavy metals. And so the difference between a regular car and a electric car over a lifetime is about 25% of carbon, right? Well, that's fine if you're in British Columbia. It's a good idea to have an electric car because we have hydroelectricity, right? But when you consider that China and India are going to be heavily carbon dependent forever, this year, India's coal production, their target is 1 billion tons, up from 700 million. China has authorized 138 coal-fired power plants just last year. In those countries where the crux of the matter lies, is if the energy comes for the electric car from coal, it doesn't really help things. So having an electric car is really nice. It makes you feel good. It certainly helps Elon Musk, but it's not going to solve the problem, right? And this is where, and even, let me give you a great example. How many of you have seen the video of the starving polar bear? Who has not seen that? It had 2.5 billion hits on the National Geographic website. The truth of the matter is there are about 16 populations, or is it 19, of polar bears in the world, 13 of which are in Canada, 11 of which the population are growing because of the treaties we set in place in the 1970s. So how do you justify and rationalize the condition of that bear seen by millions of kids if the populations are growing? Well, the answer is that Paul Nicklin, a friend of mine, and Christine Mittermeier, another friend of mine, colleagues at National Geographic, went out to find a dying bear to photograph it. And even though they knew absolutely that climate change had nothing to do with the condition of that individual bear, and even though the National Geographic, where I worked for 13 years, knew it had nothing to do, they put it out on the website under the chyron, "This is the face of climate change." It was a pure act of propaganda, untrue. And how many kids woke up that morning certain that the world was coming to an end? Is that really the solution to the greatest existential crisis the world has ever faced? No.
Is this where I tell you I have an electric car?
No, bless you for electric car. I've got a fishing lodge in the Stikine. It's going to be a long time because we have electric cars up there. Anyway,
I want to change topics now because I don't want to keep talking about climate when there's so much else. And I want you to tell us about your experience of trying, and let me not say this correctly, Mambe?
Oh.
For the first time.
My favorite subject. Well, there's an essay in the book called The Divine Leaf of Immortality. And, coca is not cocaine any more than potatoes or vodka. And when the U.S. government, there's this hilarious account of a bust at Baltimore Airport where the DEA and the aduana seized what they call 12 pounds of green cocaine. And they said that all you had to do is add some chemicals, and it was basically ounce for ounce your ordinary blow. And they heralded their intervention to save America's neighborhoods from this new menace, green cocaine. And they also found this brown paste, which they identified as having nicotine in it, but they didn't worry about that because nicotine just kills 500,000 people a year in the United States, but that's legal. And the green cocaine, if they had actually paid attention to the concentration of cocaine in the analysis, was so trivial, less than the caffeine in a coffee bean. This wasn't green cocaine, it was mambe, a sacred preparation that since 1957 we've known to be chock full of vitamins. And coca is the divine leaf of immortality. It's a fantastic story. When morphine was the first drug extracted from a plant, from opium, cocaine was the second in 1859. And because of the deleterious impact of opium, it was assumed that coca was also negative. And the real efforts to eliminate the traditional coca fields began 50 years before there was a cocaine problem. It had nothing to do with the alkaloid, everything to do with the cultural identity of the indigenous people who revered the plant. And as these bourgeois doctors and healthcare officials in Lima in the 1920s looked up in the Andes and saw social pathologies, illiteracy, poverty, hunger, there had to be a cause. And because issues of inequity exploitation, land touched too closely to the foundations of their bourgeois lives in Lima, they settled on coca. And they called on the elimination of coca. And for 60 years, that was the effort of the US government. And in all of that time, nobody bothered to do a nutritional study of the plant, even though it was consumed by 6 million Andean indigenous people, men and women. And in the 1970s, when we studied coca, that was my beginning in botany, we did the nutritional study, and the results of which horrified our backers of the US government. It had a tiny amount of the alkaloid in it, not like the salt in cocaine, that was absorbed benignly by the mucous membranes as a benign stimulant in a harsh environment. It was chock full of vitamins, more protein than most other plants consumed in the Andes, enzymes that enhance the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, perfect for a diet that lacked a dairy product. And in one assay, we put in the stark profile these horrible efforts to eliminate the fields and showed that this was a plant that had been used with no evidence of addiction or toxicity for 8,000 years.
What is the effect of it, though?
Well, this is the real great story. It's not just that coke is not cocaine, it's that the world has been robbed of the most beneficial plant ever brought into being by human genius. If you look at the testimonials from the late 19th century, not of cocaine, but of coca, travelers, physicians, even the head of the British Medical Association, the whole thing is, I don't get it. It doesn't feel like a stimulant. I'm not wired like I'm on caffeine, but I just focused for 8 hours and was more creative than I've ever been. I just walked across some mountains, climbed that mountain, came home. Oh my God, this is wonderful. In other words, the truth is, and the reason I'm on such a campaign working with President Santos, the Nobel laureate in Colombia, to decouple coca from cocaine, to give the 150,000 Colombian campesino families who depend on growing coca for their existence, to give them a legal market so we can bring to the world this incredible plant. It would sweep away coffee, and it has the ability to generate for Colombia the tax revenue that will allow that country to pay the cost of peace, having drained its treasury for 50 years, to pay for a war that would not have lasted a day without the sordid profits of prohibition. You know, you talk about your war on drugs, $1 trillion spent, and 50 years later, more people in more places using worse drugs in worse ways than ever before. And in Colombia, and I'm a Colombian citizen, it's my second country, there was a real war where 400,000 people died, 7 million were internally displaced, 5 million were forced to flee, a war that would not have lasted a day without cocaine and your consumption of it. In the last year of peace, the FARC were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly kids, girls and boys in search of a meal and a uniform. They generated $800 million in cocaine trade. You give me the Boy Scouts of Beverly Hills and $800 million, and I can wreak havoc in California. And so we have to liberate the plant from the drug. And the cultures are totally different.
And you're on a mission now to do that. You're just talking about it.
Cocaine is the most hideous drug in the world. I mean, think about it. I mean, how did we think it was glamorous to put a $100 banknote up our nose, damp with the snot of a stranger? But coca is a meditation. In the Andes, you cannot be indigenous without understanding the dance of Jalpa, which is the description of the total engagement with the plant. The way that you take 3 leaves to give to your neighbor when you meet. The way you blow across the leaves, a pulque, to take the energy of the divine to the mountains, where like the rain, it condenses into clouds to bring wealth to the soil. You cannot be runacuna without using coca. And the way that gringos stuff their mouths like horses eating hay is as vulgar as, cutting wind at a cocktail party to the people in the Andes. And And that's why it's so important, because it's not like denying coffee in the Middle East or beer to the Germans or betel nut to the Indonesians. To deny the indigenous people coca is an act of cultural genocide. And we've been doing that for 50 years. And I'll tell you one thing. When I came back from Peru in 1975, my friend Tim told me there was a job available at the USDA that he wanted me to apply for.
You're telling this story.
Yeah.
I like this story a lot.
And then he said, if you take the job, Willie, I'll kill you. And I thought that was interesting. So I go out to the USDA, and I go into this office of this plump bureaucrat. He's clearly DEA head to toe. First thing I notice, he's a drug addict. I can't get in for the cigarette smoke. Then I notice that his whole office is full of seized drug paraphernalia. It's like going to the office of an anti-pornographer and seeing the walls papered with pornography. And then I'm looking at him, and the job offer is for me to go back to, all they concluded from our research is that we're good at finding coca fields. So he wanted me to go back to Latin America, to all the coca fields, and secure all the biological pests that predate on coca, bring them back where they could be genetically manipulated and reintroduced into these fields. And I said, isn't it a little hazardous? And he put his big claw into his hairy chest. It's 1975, so he's got this big, horrible collar, and he's red hair, and he's got gold nuggets on his watch band, gold chains and everything. Pulls out this dog tag with all his agents who've been killed and so on. And of course, I walked out of the office, but I'm thinking, I know this guy. Where have I met him before? And it suddenly dawned on me, I had never physically met that man, but I knew him intimately because he was exactly like the cartel. I had lived in Medellin when the cartel emerged, and even though how sordid and murderous the trade would become was unclear at that point, the character of these people like Carlos Lila, who had that hood ornament of John Lennon on his finca, was right up the road from us in Rio Negro. They were sleazeballs, right? And murderous sleazeballs. And he was that. And I realized the DEA and the cartels are two sides energetically of the same coin. Neither one wants to end the war on drugs, right? I mean, the cartel's profits would plummet, and the DEA gets $67 billion a year, money that goes into every department of the US government. And if that money and the war on drugs actually ended, they'd be out on the street. And so that's why it goes on year after year. What other agency of government could continue to attract that kind of appropriation after a demonstrable, utter failure of implementation over 50 years? It's insane. But that's because in the American mind, drugs, the devil, and communism became one and the same. Yeah. And communism went away, and the devil had its day. And by the way, the war on drugs began with Richard Nixon, who knew how to mobilize hatred. And he didn't give a damn about drugs, as Ehrlichman's memoirs make clear. He only wanted to sever off the students, the blacks, the hippies, as he created this fantasy of the silent majority, right? Okay. And it began as he attempted to defeat McGovern in 1972, and we've dealt with the consequences of that ever since. But the Colombians have really dealt with it. Most Colombians have never seen, let alone used, cocaine. Mm-hmm. 50 million people, and during that horrible war, there were never more than 300,000 combatants on all three sides. And so for Colombia, peace is deserved, and it will only come when we eliminate the scourge of cocaine. So anyone who uses cocaine is killing people. And anyone who uses cocaine is destroying forests. And I have no tolerance for cocaine, but coca is the divine leaf of immortality. Let me just say this. In the modern economy, work is looking at a screen, right? If I could tell you there was a substance you could take that kind of got rid of your daily malaise, which is really the affliction of humanity. Didn't get your homework done, didn't get your kid off to school on time, you got that report to write, and you kind of got to your desk and you had a little bit of lightness in your step. And you suddenly found yourself a little bit more confident as you wrote that first line of the report or that first line of code. And you suddenly found yourself, unlike with coffee where you get wired and jittery and you feel hopelessly incapacitated, you get closer and closer to your work. And by the end of 8 hours, you realize, oh, that's pretty good. And then you go home, have a run, have dinner, and you start all over again tomorrow. And you're trying to keep your busy life alive, and you're a writer, and you get on an airplane. And instead of watching a movie, having a drink, or worrying about what you said at the conference, you go right back to what you wrote this morning at the same sentence, the same paragraph, the same word, and it just flows off your fingertips. Now, wouldn't that be attractive? Well, that's what Coca does. And people always say, you've written 24 books. How did you do it?
Have you got any with you? Oh, okay. Your last essay is on the sacred and the meaning of the sacred. You've traveled this world. You've been everywhere. You've looked at so much. What is sacred to you?
Well, it's funny. When I was a little boy, my mom and dad never went to church. But I marched off on my own. I had a best friend who went to a church, and I went there religiously for 7 years. Excuse the phrase. I even have a little gold star to show for it. And I went there because I went there to be in the presence of God. And for the longest time he was there. I didn't worship the building. I went to be in the presence. And the longest time he showed up. And one day as I got to know the world, he just didn't turn up. And when I went back to that community outside of Montreal years later, I realized that what I'd been seeking was not God, but some spirit that inspired human beings. Like I remember walking around and every blade of grass resonated with a story. Shadows marked the ground where trees had fallen in my absence. New constructions I took as violations of something sacred that lay on the confluence of landscape and memory. And I realized what I'd been really looking for was that sense of luminous spirit around us. What is it that creates the sacred? It's human desire, it's agency, it's human agency that turns a building of rock into a sacred space, or that, turns a relic into something resonant with spiritual meaning, like an old tool warm from decades of human touch. And the interesting thing is religion is all about death. My dad used to say every church should have a billboard outside it saying important if true. And really every religion is just an attempt to wrestle with eternity and come out on top, right? That's all it is. Religion's all about death and dealing with the inexorable mystery that lies beyond death. But the sacred has nothing to do with death. The sacred is all about life. It's all about the beauty of the world right now. And in that sense, the sacred, elusive as it is all around us. And the path of the pilgrim never ends. And the sacred is as immediate to us as it was to the seekers of old, right? And a friend of mine, Shefa Siegel, a wonderful graduate student I had who turned me on to D.H. Lawrence, and Shefa had this great quote from D.H. Lawrence that, before Buddha and the Christ spoke, the nightingale sang. And long after the Buddha and Christ are gone, the nightingale will still sing. And the goal in life is to be like that bird floating through the sky at one with the sacred.
And I think that is a great place to end.
You have been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To hear more events like this one and view our upcoming events, visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.